Welcome to the Real Crusades History Podcast. This is going to be episode 7 in our first Crusade podcast series. So we have come to the big moment. We've come to the climax of the First Crusade, and that is the Siege of Jerusalem. This is what the Crusaders have been longing for quite some time, really throughout the course of everything we've talked about on this podcast. This has kind of always been the big spiritual goal of the First Crusade, and we're going to talk about it now. So last time we spoke a little bit about the march on Jerusalem, and the interesting thing about that was how swiftly they really made that move from down the Palestinian coast. And we're going to jump into some of that in a little bit here. I'm going to go and introduce our panel for the evening. My name is J. Stephen Roberts, and I'm going to be joined, as usual, by Mr. Rand Brown. Rand, welcome. Semper Fi.
Ra.
All right, good to have you. And we've also got our academic guest for the evening, who's been with us throughout this series on the First Crusade, Dr. William Hamblin, who runs an excellent website called crusadingwarfare.net, which is a repository of information about the military history of the Crusades. Dr. Hamblin, thanks for being here with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So let's talk about the Siege of Jerusalem. Last time we discussed a little bit about the some of the background, I guess you could say, leading up to the Siege of Jerusalem. The Crusaders' actual march on Jerusalem, their march down the coastline of Palestine. And really, their goal at that phase was to move as quickly as possible. They didn't bother or didn't attempt to besiege a lot of these coastal cities that are held by various Muslim powers, and we discussed that. So one thing that we really need to get into, I think, for this particular podcast is a discussion of the Fatimids, because Dr. Hamblin, as last time you mentioned, this is really the third major enemy, the third Muslim opponent that the Crusaders are going to face. And the Fatimids are a very interesting and kind of unique dynasty in the very diverse history of medieval Islamic powers. And Dr. Hamblin, it's interesting too, you actually did your doctoral work on the Fatimids, didn't you?
Right. Fatimid response to the First Crusade, or first couple of decades of the Crusade. So, yes.
Yeah, and I think the Fatimids are kind of a neglected point of interest in the Crusades oftentimes. So, Dr. Hamblin, I'm going to have you start us out here, since you are quite well versed in the history of the Fatimids. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about who the Fatimids were and sort of what their role is in this point in the First Crusade?
Do you want the good parts version or the long version? I'll give you the good parts version.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah.
A fundamental issue arose in Islam after the death of Muhammad. Muhammad was a prophet from the Muslim perspective, and his successors, however, were generally not considered prophets. They were called successors, Khalifa, or sometimes Imam, which means leader. And essentially, a dispute arose after the death of Muhammad, which went on for several decades, over who should be his successor and how the successor should be chosen. And the majority seemed to think that the successor should be chosen as the best man for the job, kind of a meritocracy. And they become known as the Sunnis, meaning those who follow the lifestyle or the example of the Prophet Muhammad. Another very large group, however, believed that succession to Muhammad should come through his family, that it should be a genealogical succession rather than an election. And both of those were part of ancient and medieval tribal societies, kind of mixed succession by family and succession by election. It's a very complicated story, but basically, as time progressed, descendants of Ali who was Muhammad's closest male relative. He was his nephew and his son-in-law and his adopted brother, because Muhammad had been adopted by Ali's father. Ali marries Muhammad's most important daughter, named Fatima. And so descendants of Ali and Fatima became the potential leaders of the Muslim community from the Shiite perspective. So these people were called Shiites, meaning Shi'at Ali, which means the party or the faction or the supporters of Ali. This is the group that believes that Ali should be the caliph and then all of his descendants. And eventually, over the course, these people lost the political and military battle for succession. Other families take over, the Umayyads and Abbasids and so forth. But a strong minority of Muslims continued to believe that succession should come from the descendants of Ali and Fatima. So the term Fatimids, which was the name of the dynasty that ruled Egypt during the time of the Crusades, comes from the name of Muhammad's daughter, because the leaders of the Fatimids were descendants of Muhammad through his daughter Fatima and Ali. And they eventually break into they break into many factions. The problem is, each generation, the number of descendants of Muhammad multiplies. And so the number, who's a potential descendant, by the 500 years after Muhammad, it could be in the thousands or even tens of thousands. And so different Shiite groups start to follow different of these descendants. And at one point, the seventh Imam, whose name is Ismail, one faction follows him and another follows his rival Jafar. And then they split into what are known as seveners, that is the people who follow the seventh Imam Ismail, and the other guys become known as twelvers, who follow the 12th Imam. And it's really complicated. But these seveners, also known as Ismailis, start to preach in North Africa, and they preach to the Berbers, the tribesmen out in the desert and the mountains. And around 909, they start converting some of the Berber tribes. These are not Arabs, but they are Muslims, but they're kind of marginal Muslims and tribal Muslims out in the wilderness. They convert them. They become followers then of these descendants of Fatima, and they're known as the Fatimids ever after. And this movement starts in North Africa and very rapidly expands all across North Africa. And in 969, they conquer Egypt. And they move their capital from Kairouan in, Al-Mahdiya, a different city in North Africa, to Egypt. And that becomes what's known as the Fatimid Caliphate. That is the group. They are a Shiite sevener group whose lineage is from Fatima, who are rulers then of all of North Africa. And after they conquer Egypt and transfer their capital to a new city called Cairo, which they found, they have about 100 years of their imperial period. And their goal was to conquer and unite all the Muslim world, and to overthrow the what you might call apostate or wicked Abbasids who ruled from Baghdad, and then to unite all Islam into a single great empire. So restore the golden age of the caliphs after Muhammad and do away with these falsely claimed caliphs from Baghdad. They almost did it. In 1058 and 1059, they actually captured Baghdad, and the Caliph Al-Qa'im flees. But a group of recently converted Turks the Seljuk Turks, under a man named Tughril Bey, drives the Fatimids out of Baghdad and restores Al-Qa'im and becomes kind of the savior of the Abbasid world and the Sunni world. And shortly after that, Egypt falls into a huge crisis. The crisis it begins with a famine that lasts about a decade. It also comes with a civil war, which lasts from 1066 to 1076, and all sorts of rival soldiers in the army. They had Berbers, Iranians, Egyptians, Black Africans, Armenians, Turks, all these different groups started fighting each other over who would be in charge. And it wasn't until 1076 that a man named Badr Jamali, who was an Armenian but had been a Mamluk, that is a military slave, taken when the Turks conquered Armenia. He would have been enslaved about 12, 13 years old, enrolled in this military system, and he ends up becoming the commander of the armies and basically takes over Egypt. The Fatimid Caliph is still there, but he's a figurehead now. He's the puppet of Badr Jamali and his son Al-Afdal, who is the actual man who faces the Crusaders. So Badr Jamali saves the Fatimid state, but in the process, he loses Syria and Palestine, which the Fatimids had conquered. He loses those to the Turks. So as the Crusaders come on the scene about a decade or two before the Crusaders arrive, Turkish warlords had penetrated Syria and Palestine, but it was still politically divided between Shiite factions and city-states that were loyal to the Fatimids, and Turkish city-states, and a bunch of city-states who wanted nothing to do with either the Turks or the Egyptians. So a lot of times the Fatimids are called Egyptians because that was where their base of power was. But they're not necessarily ethnically Egyptian. They tended to use outside mercenaries and military. One other quick note, and then I shall cease, and that is in 1094, the Caliph al-Mustansir, who was the puppet of Badr Jamali, he dies. And his chosen successor was a man named Nizar. But Al-Afdal, the son of Badr Jamali, says that on his deathbed, Mustansir said, I want my other son to rule, not Nizar. Nizar should not rule, it should be my other son, who happened to be a young teenager who Al-Afdal could control. So basically, a civil war breaks out in 1097, or from 1094 to 1097. And Al-Afdal eventually wins and kills Nizar, but his wife, who is pregnant with his son, Nizar's wife, flees to Syria and becomes the assassins. Now, they're known in the Muslim world as either Ismailis or Nizaris, that is, the followers of Nizar. But in the Crusader world, they become known as the assassins. So these assassins are a group whose goal is to assassinate illegitimate caliphs. And eventually they turn into a kind of a terrorist movement. But initially, their goal is to assassinate Al-Afdal, and they actually succeed in that in the long run. But a man known as Hassan al-Sabah takes in Nizar's son, who is like, 2 years old or something, and gets an impregnable castle in Iran, in Alamut, where he protects him. And Hassan al-Sabah becomes the real leader of the movement, which eventually becomes known as Assassins. And they're going to interact with the Crusaders in all sorts of ways throughout the rest of history. But that is a splinter group that's drawn off from the Fatimids. After Al-Afdal, the Fatimids decline very dramatically in military power, and they're still around till Saladin's time in the 1070s, but they're not militarily important after Al-Afdal. And so the man that the Crusaders are going to meet is Al-Afdal, and he's the real ruler of Egypt, and he's also the commander of all the armies. And his goal is to restore the Fatimid state as it was 20 or 30 years before, when they ruled all of Syria and all of Palestine and all of Lebanon. Whereas when the Crusaders come on the scene, they have a couple of towns on the coast. And it wasn't until 1098 that they retook Jerusalem from the Turks. So that's the political background. You've got these warlords ruling over nominal Shiite Fatimid caliphs. Anyway, any questions on that?
Yeah, that's some really good background history for the Fatimids. They really were, earlier than this period, they kind of were the major Islamic power in that region, and they are very interesting because they were Shia, whereas we're kind of used to the big Islamic powers of the medieval world being Sunni. And yeah, the Fatimids are interesting too. I mean, they had a pretty rich artistic tradition.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and sort of a flourishing court culture going on there, where there's quite a bit of intersection with other parts of the world. Obviously, the Byzantines had kind of an interesting relationship with the Fatimids. I mean, they were both an enemy, but then there was a lot of diplomatic exchange and that sort of thing. Especially, once the Turks come on the scene, they kind of start kind of trying to cooperate with one another to get rid of the Turks. Isn't that right, Dr. Hamlin?
Exactly. They, the enemy of my enemy type of thing, and both the Byzantines and the Fatimids, their major enemy was the Turks. And so to the extent that they could cooperate to defeat the Turks, they did so. The problem was there were two fronts. There was the Anatolian front and the Palestinian front of Turkish warfare, and they didn't really intersect a lot. That is, the Fatimids couldn't send an army to help the Byzantines or anything like that. So it was more of a grand strategic alliance rather than a practical, tactical alliance.
Right. So this is the enemy that.
One other thing: the Fatimids had the only effective Muslim navy in the Middle East, which is going to become important because of the importance of navies to the Crusaders. Crusader naval power is one of the basis of the establishment and success of their kingdom. And so Fatimid as a naval power is another issue. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine. So, but yeah, this is the enemy that the Crusaders are going to be facing when they arrive in Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. And I'm going to start with a date here, June 7th, 1099. The Crusaders, they arrive at this point that's known as Mount Joy, which is this point on the road to Jerusalem from the coast where Jerusalem first comes into view. And it's kind of a traditional spot where pilgrims catch sight of Jerusalem. And, when the Crusaders catch sight of Jerusalem, it's a very dramatic thing. This is a big moment, obviously. They've been waiting to get to Jerusalem, and finally they see it. So the Fatimids didn't really oppose the Crusader advance on Jerusalem.
Actually, just real quick.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Ren.
Go back to Mount Joy, or as it's known in French, Mont Joie. That would actually become a very important cultural. It would have a lot of cultural significance to just the medieval West, even long after the Crusades were over. Mont Joie became a very common battle cry in Western Europe, even long after the Crusading period was over. So it was one of those things that really left a very strong cultural mark on Western Europe, even long after the Crusades were no longer a thing.
If you visit it today, it's called Nabi Samuel, and it's an interesting place because it's a Christian church, which is very, architecturally, very clearly a Christian church, which had been turned into a mosque and still semi-functions as a mosque, and then also has a Jewish synagogue there, and it's dedicated to the prophet Samuel of the Bible. So at that spot, you could see a church, a mosque, and a synagogue all trying to occupy the same spot, which is really emblematic of the whole issue, with the Holy Land being a holy land for three different peoples. So
it's sort of a microcosm of the old city of Jerusalem.
Exactly. And they've done some excavations around it, and you can see a lot of Crusader houses, and it's just foundation stone stuff. But there's a mill and there's an olive press, and also it was a little Crusader town during the Crusade era.
I think even clear into the late 15th century, with like the professional French armies that invaded Italy, their war cry, the traditional French war cry was still Mont Joie, Saint Denis, Mount Joy, and Saint Denis. So it's that's how far, that's how much of a cultural mark that mountain made on Western Europe.
Yeah, and I was going to read this little blurb from Ralph of Caen, who wrote one of the primary sources we have for the First Crusade. He wrote the Gesta Tancredi, which is kind of a biographical conception of Tancred's journey to Jerusalem during the First Crusade. But anyway, he said this is Ralph's depiction of Tancred first catching sight of Jerusalem at Mount Joy. He turned to gaze toward the city, from which he was now separated only by the Valley of Josaphat, and saw the Lord's sepulcher. Drawing a great sigh, he sat down on the ground, and would willingly have given his life there and then, just for one chance to press his lips to that most holy church. So I think, and we kind of get that sort of thing from each of the chroniclers. That gives us an idea of kind of some of the emotion behind what it was to, for the Crusaders of this long journey to approach Jerusalem.
There's also a story told about Richard Lionheart later when he comes to the place and they say, come up here to the top and you can see Jerusalem. And he supposedly covers his face with his shield because he realizes he's not going to be able to capture the city. And so he kind of refuses to look upon it because it's, he's so overwhelmed with emotion. So it's kind of the same and yet the opposite of the reaction of Tancred.
Right. Yeah, he didn't want to look at it because he said he didn't want to look at Jerusalem until he looked on it as a conqueror. So that's what we're looking at here. And I've got a little bit of information about Jerusalem itself. The walls of Jerusalem were 4 kilometers long, 15 meters high, and 3 meters thick, enclosing an area of 86 hectares.
Hectares.
That's one of those words you always see and you never pronounce it. So it's kind of like Antioch. It's studded with some towers, not as many towers as Antioch had, but on the northwest corner we've got the Quadrangular Tower, and then midway along the western wall we've got what's called the Tower of David, and that's actually the citadel.
A lot of these fortifications, although the fortifications that were there during the Crusader period are long gone. The walls that encircle the old city of Jerusalem today, that date from the Ottoman period, the early Ottoman period, they were actually built for the most part on the same route as the old walls were. So. For anybody who's ever fortunate enough to actually go to Jerusalem, you can get a very decent idea from the walls that are there today. You can actually see a lot of the towers are still built on the same place as the old ones were, and the gatehouses are pretty much all in the same place. So you can get a very, very clear picture of what it would have looked like. From the fortifications that exist there today.
If you go down to the south wall and walk along the inside of the south wall, they've done some archaeology which has uncovered the Crusader Era Foundations. And you can see clear distinction between the types of stones they used. It's actually more Ayyubid that survives, but at any rate, it's quite clear that this is simply a rebuilding of the tower on the old foundations of the Crusaders, and that's most apparent along the inside of the south wall.
Yep.
Right. And so, again, as we talked about earlier, the Fatimids are defending Jerusalem at this time. There's a Fatimid garrison run by a man named Iftikhar ad-Daulah. He's supported by 400 elite Egyptian cavalrymen. Iftikhar does something similar also to what Yagi-Sihan did at Antioch. He actually expels the Christian inhabitants from Jerusalem because, again, he's concerned about the possibility of these people collaborating with the Crusaders from the inside. And the chroniclers of the First Crusade talk about how the fact that these Christian refugees, I guess, come out of Jerusalem and they join them in their camp, and they actually turn out to be very helpful to the Crusaders in the course of the siege. Iftikhar also poisons or destroys all of the water sources around Jerusalem. And this is going to be very difficult because the territory around Jerusalem is fairly arid already. The chroniclers describe it as, there's no trees. Jerusalem's kind of situated on this very hilly, region, and the land surrounding it is very arid. Meanwhile, inside of Jerusalem itself, there are plenty of cisterns that the Fatimids can use to supply themselves with water. So at this point, the Latin forces number, this is the information I got from Thomas Asbridge. We've got 1,300 knights at this point, and around 12,000 able-bodied men left in the army that's going to be actually attacking Jerusalem. A lot of people have died on the way. Also, a lot of people stayed behind in Antioch with Bohemond, and then we've got people off in Edessa and other garrisons for conquered areas that have been left behind. So that's what we're looking at right now. And the leaders that we've got who are in control of the army at this point, we've got, I guess we could kind of say, two factions, really. We've got Godfrey of Bouillon, who's kind of emerging as sort of the new leading personality in the army. Raymond of Toulouse would have preferred, I think, to have been kind of the overall commander of the army. But a lot of historians think that at this point Raymond was kind of losing a lot of his clout with some, sort of the major elements of the army. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is going to be the fact that he was from Provence, or he was Provençal, and this area of southern France that's they speak a different language than a lot of the northern French and Norman forces that make up a lot of the army. And Godfrey is actually joined by a couple of the other major leaders who we've already discussed. Tancred is in Godfrey's camp at this point, and Robert II of Flanders. And these two factions of the army are going to be besieging Jerusalem from two different sides of the city, in fact. So let's kind of talk a little bit about that. Dr. Hamblin, do you want to discuss sort of what goes on here, when they arrive, when they start setting up their camps? What do the Crusaders do at this point?
Well, the way Jerusalem, or Old Jerusalem, was situated, it had very steep, kind of hilly, rugged slopes on the east and west side and most of the south side. And the only truly accessible side was the north from the military perspective. And if you go back through the history of the different sieges of Jerusalem, the major attacks are always on the north. But by a place called Zion's Gate, and what is today called Mount Zion, wasn't the biblical one, but that's kind of how the name migrated there. That it has a level kind of hill right out by the southern wall on the south west corner, and that's where Raymond sets up. So they basically set up their army everywhere that they can reach the wall. If the hill is too steep, you can't push a ram or a siege tower up against it. And so the only options were that southwest corner and the north wall. And that's exactly where they attacked. So strategically speaking, that was their only option. Their problem was that they assaulted the walls. They made an initial assault, but it fails pretty miserably. And they realized that just like at Nicaea, the only way they're going to take the city is with siege equipment. But their big problem is there's no good timber for building. You need some pretty big logs to build some of these, like the ram, and also the four corners of a siege tower need to have a very tall, thick, strong log. It's got to be, 30, 40 feet tall to work. And there's simply not timber of that quality in the area. The problem is Jerusalem had been deforested over the course of, 3,000 or 4,000 years of habitation. And
Well,
so,
and even with their native vegetation, I mean, really it really impressed on me when I was there last summer. The only real native wooded trees are the olive trees,
right.
and they're very low growing. They're very kind of straggly. They're not very well suited to carpentry. At all of any kind. So it really is, it did strike me when I was there just how much of a challenge that topography was there around the old city.
Right, exactly. And so with no timber, they're not going to be able to build the siege equipment. Without siege equipment, they can't take the city. So they're kind of in a conundrum here. The other big problem they face is water. And in July, which is the hottest time of the year, it's a serious problem. I've hiked around Israel quite a bit, and in July, and you dehydrate very rapidly. And being in a suit of armor in that heat, I've never tried that, and I never will. It would be a significant addition to the amount of water you would need to drink. The problem was there's no such water. There's plenty in the city, because they have all these huge cisterns there, and they're fun to go down and wander through. You can still do it a little bit as a tourist. But there is a spring on the south, and then there's another spring a few kilometers away. So they could get some water, but it was basically insufficient for their needs. And so there arises a major problem of dehydration among the soldiers, which is going to really sap their strength and their ability to fight. These problems are solved by the arrival at Jaffa of a fleet of 6 ships from Genoa. And we need to note that the city of Ramla the walls had been destroyed by an earthquake. So it was basically not very defensible. And the Muslims fled from that city when the Crusaders came. Jaffa had the same problem. It only a Turk named Aziz, who had ruled Jerusalem for a bit back in the 1070s, he conquered Jaffa and destroyed the walls because he didn't want the Fatimids to use that as a naval base in their war against the Turks. So Jaffa had been rendered essentially defenseless, and so had Ramla. And this is crucial for the Crusaders because the Arabs or the Muslims make no attempt to defend those cities. And what that does is give them a base. Ramla is a base of operation between Jaffa and Jerusalem. And then Jaffa is a port they could use. And these Genoese come in, and basically they tear down some of their masts and maybe cannibalize the ships entirely, and drag the wood up to Jerusalem. And the masts of these Genoese ships and then other timber from these ships is utilized to build the siege towers and rams that they make. And this is crucial to this victory. The ultimate victory of the Crusaders is they get what you'd call military grade timber that they need from the Genoese fleet. They also get engineers and craftsmen, because these seafarers are great carpenters. You've got to have active, knowledgeable carpenters on a ship, because the ship is always, got some type of something breaking, and something needs, some type of woodwork needs to be done. And also just a day or two after the fleet from Genoa arrives, the Fatimid fleet arrives at Jaffa and basically cuts off that access. And if the fleet had arrived a couple days earlier, the Genoese may not have been able to get the timber and the supplies and the engineers that come up and help the Crusaders to build their siege towers and their rams. So they probably needed, I would say, 10 large, tall, 30-foot plus 40-foot beams, mast-like beams, to make their 2 siege towers and their 2 rams. And so this is another case where crucial timing of the fleet arriving and avoiding the Fatimid fleet and getting that equipment up to them is another one of those things where the Crusaders just, they just luck out and they squeak by just perfectly with what they need. And so the whole siege shifts to a new situation once that military grade timber arrives.
Yeah, that's kind of a common thing in the First Crusade, is these almost just acts of God that seem to, very fortunate breaks that seem to help things out. And there's another way that the Crusaders are able to gain some timber. The local Christians who had been expelled from Jerusalem show Robert of Flanders and Robert of Normandy. They lead them to an area that's not too far away, where they actually are able to obtain some wood as well. So,
yeah, there are actually some of the sources refer to Tancred discovering, or some of his men discovering caches of timber, of leftover timber that the Egyptians had left behind, or that, excuse me, that the Fatimids had left behind, and they were like in caves and cisterns. In fact, I think one of the sources, I can't remember which one, talks about one of these caches was found by one of the lords when he went into the cave for some privacy as he was dealing with a bout of dysentery. So so there were some like very small caches of workable wood that were in the area, and yes, as you mentioned, the local Christians were ideally suited to. They knew the land, they knew the terrain, they knew the area way better than the Latins did.
Right.
And we're
Another thing to note is that Al-Afdal had besieged Jerusalem about 10 months before the Crusaders arrived, and he had brought in all sorts of timber to make siege equipment, a lot of maginelles or catapults, and it's not quite clear if he built towers. But that wood was probably just abandoned when they didn't make these things and then take them off to another place. They sometimes would make them, tear them down, move the wood again. But you would have had some of his equipment kind of lying around but most of the wood they got around Jerusalem was probably used to build platforms and the walls of the towers. You need those 4 giant beams to kind of set the whole structure going. And then you can fill it in with the smaller pieces of timber they could have found around.
right. So that's kind of what goes on for the next several weeks. Is the Crusaders are busy building these siege towers and other siege equipment. Godfrey of Bouillon has a guy who's kind of heading the task of building the siege equipment for him, and that is this guy who from Provence. He's a Provençal, like Raymond IV of Toulouse, Gaston of Béarn. And he actually had traveled originally with Raymond, but he had switched his allegiance to Godfrey. He's kind of an interesting guy. He's actually going to return to Spain. He's actually going to end up in Spain after the First Crusade. He becomes one of the right-hand men of Alfonso I of Aragon, and is pretty heavily involved in some of the Reconquista crusades that Alfonso I is pushing. But yeah, I find that interesting. There are several guys actually who are involved in the First Crusade and who are heavily involved in the siege of Jerusalem, who end up in the Iberian Peninsula shortly after this. Mostly southern French guys like Gaston of Béarn. But yeah, so he supervises the construction of Godfrey's siege engine. Meanwhile, Raymond is building a siege tower. And yeah, this is pretty interesting stuff. This equipment they build. They also work on building this large battering ram with an iron-covered head. And they build these mangonels, which are like little catapults. And then they build these things called sow screens, which are kind of these just big screens that are used to protect men and equipment as they move up to sap the walls or do anything involving attacking the walls at close range. And then, of course, they're going to build some scaling ladders. So yeah, pretty major construction project going on here. Do either of you want to talk at all about the siege equipment that the Crusaders are working on, Dr. Hamblin or Rand, or do you both want to talk about it?
why don't we let Rand go first, and I'll add anything that suits my fancy.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're probably gonna know a little bit more about it. You have a better grasp on it than I will, Dr. Hamlin. But of course, the major focus was the tower. That was what was going to actually get a significant amount of forces over the top of the wall. In numbers significant enough to actually push back the defenders that are up on the top. And establish basically a toehold on top of the walls. So,
hey, Rand.
Yeah.
Hey, your audio is a little bit rough. Are you kind of far away from the computer or something?
No. Is that better?
Possibly, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, go ahead.
So, typically most siege towers of this period, siege towers were really, there really wasn't a whole lot of variation. Most of them, they all followed pretty much the same concept. So, you've got your quadrangular structure, it was definitely, kind of like a square tower shaped. And it was on wheels or a track or some kind of a sledge, something where, it could be moved up to a wall. And then up on top, you usually had a compartment with a ramp that was made just high enough to where when that ramp came down, it came over the walls and was able to disgorge its payload on the top. So, but the key thing about a siege tower was they were a lot more effective than just simple ladders, because with a ladder, only one man at a time can get up to the top. Whereas with a siege tower, if it was built within certain proportions, you could actually disgorge, maybe a dozen, possibly even more men all at once onto the top of the wall. So there was a much better chance. You had a little bit more. It could bring a little bit more force and numbers to bear all at once on the top of the wall, as opposed to ladders where they would just have to deal with the men one at a time, as they came up. So that was going to be the tower is going to be what most of the Crusader effort is directed towards. The only problem with towers were extremely vulnerable, especially because they were such large structures. They made very easy targets for enemy missile fire. And if you didn't fireproof them, either using moistened animal skins or leather, or some of the more advanced ones, they were able to put like some steel plating on it, but which the Crusaders weren't able to do. They didn't even remotely have those kinds of resources. But basically, you're looking at a giant wooden structure that would not have been difficult to either hit with siege engines up on the wall or set on fire, with flaming missiles. So there definitely was a significant risk. And one of the things that's interesting about the Crusaders in front of Jerusalem is that they only built one. They only had enough stuff. They only had enough materials to build one of these. Typically, in sieges, you wanted to have several, and so that if one did get destroyed, you had a backup. Here, the Crusaders really didn't have a backup, other than I believe they also constructed a ram, I think. But that
they did.
That I think the ram was, again, you're not going to get the kind of you're not going to have the kind of success as you would with a tower. But this was it. They only had enough materials to make one of these, and if anything happened to it, they were going to be in a much more difficult position.
Yeah, they only built one on the north wall, but they did They tried to build one on the south wall as well, but it got destroyed by fire from the Muslims. So, the northern one could have been destroyed just as well, but they did a very interesting trick, which is Godfrey built the tower in essentially in such a way that it could be disassembled and reassembled fairly easily. And probably using jointed corners on the wood and maybe wooden doles, wooden pegs to hold it together rather than nails. And he built it up against the north west part of the northern wall. And then at night, he tore it down, moved it, I don't know, 100 or so, 200 yards, and then reassembled it to the east of what they called St. Stephen's Gate, but which I think today is called Herod's Gate. There's a problem with gates in Jerusalem, and that is Muslims, Christians, and Jews all have different names for them. So it gets a little confusing. But he reassembles it there, and the Muslims had done all of their defensive work and preparations where they saw the tower, 50, 100 yards away. They thought, okay, it's coming at this point of the wall. Here's where we're going to work on defending the wall. And suddenly the next morning, it's at a different place. And it made the Muslims inside are doing all sorts of preparations for against the siege tower as well. One of the things they do is add towers, wooden towers they build on the stone tower to make their part, because they know right where the tower is going to come. And if you build another tower taller than the tower, you've kind of blocked it so that you can't lower the drawbridge. They also lowered a bunch of bales of cotton and sticks and things. In part, that was to serve as a armor against catapult stones, so that the stones would hit a bale of cotton and just bounce off rather than hit the wall. But the other things those did, if you had it 3 or 4 feet thick and hanging down in front of the wall, when the tower is pushed up against that, it can no longer, it can't get close enough to the wall. You know what I'm saying? The drawbridge is only so long, and if you stop too far away from the wall, the drawbridge won't make it. And that's one of the reasons they eventually are going to make glacis, which are sloping walls. You have the wall of the fortress, and then a sloping wall that might go out 10 feet. And then if you push your siege tower up against a glacis, the drawbridge is not going to be close enough to the wall to actually allow you to assault it. Now, the original wall of Jerusalem didn't have that, but they did have an outer barricade and then a ditch. It was a dry moat. And the ram destroys the outer barricade, and they had to do that because the tower would be stopped by this outer wall. It wasn't really tall, maybe 5 feet tall, and men could fight behind it as standing on the ground and fighting behind it. But the wall would stop a tower from progressing. So would the moat. And so what those things did, delay the advance. And they used the ram to destroy the outer wall. And then they had to fill in the moat, the dry moat, with rubble in order to push the tower against it. And if you didn't have a flat enough surface, the towers could kind of become unstable and wobble because their base to height ratio was fairly long. That is, they were a lot taller than they were wide. And that's basically because the more width you give it, the heavier it becomes and the harder it is to push. But if the width is not wide enough, it's going to become unstable. The top part's going to sway. And so you've got all sorts of engineering problems that they faced as they tried to do this. But basically, once the tower gets up to the wall, they use suppressing fire from the top of the tower. They shoot catapult or arrows and crossbows and maybe some throwing stones and things, and they clear the wall directly in front of where the gate, the drawbridge is going to fall. Then they lower that bridge and charge across the bridge. And what that does is give them a concentration of force at one point where they outnumber the defenders, because number one, the defenders would have to clear out or they'd be killed by the archery from the top of the tower. And number two, the defenders can only be 1 or 2 men deep. You know what I'm saying? Because the wall isn't 20 feet
Mhm.
thick and you can line up 20 or 30 men there. It's wide enough for 1 or 2 men. If you go up against a stone tower, then you could have 30 men on the tower. But on the wall itself, you can only have a couple of men. So at that moment, at that spot with a 6 foot wide, 8 foot wide drawbridge, the Crusaders had concentration of force and overwhelmed the Muslims, 10 to 1, 20 to 1 even. And once they get on the wall, then it's a matter of pushing the people on the wall, perpendicular to the wall, try to drive them off the wall, and then get down into the city and capture a gate, and then open the gate, and then even more men can come in even faster. But that's more or less how they did it, as far as we can tell from the sources. And that type of both technology and technique is very common at this age for the Crusaders. I mean, they're throughout the rest of the time they'll build towers quite frequently.
Yeah, so basically, that's a good overview of what happens at kind of this crucial final assault on Jerusalem. And yeah, I think it is pretty interesting. On the night of July 13th, they break down this tower, and they're able to do this clandestine move of the tower. The Fatimids had been fortifying this position where Godfrey had been building the tower, and instead they move it overnight to this position close to Stephen's Gate, or St. Stephen's Gate, which is the weaker part of the city. And yeah, that kind of makes all the difference in the world. That's where they're going to direct their attacks. And another interesting thing I find about the actual assault on the walls is when they use the battering ram, like you were talking about, Dr. Hamlin, to break through that outer wall. And at one point, like the Muslims are trying to set this battering ram on fire. And at one point, and of course the Crusaders are trying to stop it from being set on fire. But the ram gets stuck in the wall. And then at that point, the Crusaders start trying to burn the ram so they can kind of further destroy the wall. And the Muslims frantically try to put the ram out. So it's kind of this back and forth, It sort of says something about, the nature of siege warfare, I think, which is it's very it's kind of close quarter, type fighting, and also there's a lot of improvisation that's got to happen,
Mhm.
We need to note, I think, that you've kind of got to put out of your mind the way movies depict catapult and these types of things. Number one, catapult stones don't explode, even if they are pyrotechnic. They simply spread around a liquid that burns. So you don't have these huge explosions. It would take numerous trebuchet or catapult stones to crack a wall. It would take, and they fire relatively slowly. So what you got to do is, if you watch a movie and you see a siege depicted in a movie, you've got to watch it in slow motion to get a sense of what's really going on. and the people on the walls, whatever the Crusaders were trying to do would be telegraphed to them, because it would take, I think it took a day for them to push the tower up to the wall. Maybe not quite that long, but it would take hours and hours. And these things are not mobile. You can't, suddenly turn and shift it 45 degrees and push it somewhere else. You line it up and it's going to go straight forward, and that's it. There's no steering wheel. And so the response that the Muslims had prepared for the tower was probably catapults and naphtha. Naphtha is Muslim Greek fire. They had incendiaries, maybe not exactly the same formula as the Byzantine Greek fire, but they prepared this material with projectile machines to cast it, and they were built on towers where the original Northern Crusade tower was directed against. And when they moved the tower, they had to make a huge effort to try to move all their catapults and other incendiaries to the new position, and the Crusaders attacked fast enough and to essentially avoid that. There was fire used against it, but not sufficient to destroy it. Whereas against Raymond's tower, there was a prepared position of defense, and they were successful in destroying the tower, probably because they knew where it was coming and had prepared all their incendiary and other types of equipment to burn the tower. Whereas the one in the north, because it moved, their prepared position was suddenly useless, and they had to scramble to try to stop it, and they couldn't do it in time. If they'd had a day or two, they probably could have. But in fact, the amount of time they had was insufficient to prepare a new set of special defenses against where the tower actually came, as opposed to where it seemed that it was going to be coming before the Crusaders moved it at night.
Yeah, good point about the movie, thing where they show these sieges. It always does blow my mind. Do you guys remember the scene in Kingdom of Heaven where Saladin is attacking Jerusalem, and he basically uses like cruise missiles?
Yeah.
I really just try to block every memory of that film out. But it's well, and you do, and I think Dr. Hamlin brings up a really good point. Just kind of, in many ways, with I think combat in general, during this time, but especially within the context of a siege, is that combat, the actual fighting was very few and far between. A lot of it really was just this kind of constant maneuvering, reorienting towards, whatever wherever the attacker had moved, or wherever the defender had, positioned himself. And sieges were they were very slow, often sometimes very dull affairs, where really, a lot of times it was just kind of a waiting game to see, who could outweight the other. Now that's obviously not what happened at Jerusalem, but you still had a lot of this. The vast majority of it was really just everybody positioning themselves, and reorienting as the other, tried to come from a different position, and things like that. I would say there's one film depiction of a siege kind of from this time period that I felt at least tried to be a little bit more accurate, and that was, if anybody saw the more recent Robin Hood film with Russell Crowe, the Siege of Chalus Castle that they portray. They portray like, they set the main gate on fire, and then they all just like go back to their camp for the night. And they're like, it'll burn down, like, hopefully by the morning, and everybody kind of like, they're done for the day, and you put in your shift, and you punched your time clock, and you went back to the camp for the night. That was probably more what sieges were like. It was, you probably had shifts, of guys who, they were either on watch, or it was their turn to slowly move the siege tower forward, or man the walls, or whatever, and then you just had probably rotating shifts like that on both sides. And then the shift who was off, they went off and, probably got some sleep or some food, or, something, to pass the time.
The actual experience of an ordinary soldier of a siege would be a whole bunch of manual labor and a whole bunch of sitting around and waiting, rather than actual fighting. And usually it was out of range of the enemy. And so, you weren't in any real threat. You'd kind of set up your camp out of archery range, and, probably searching for food and water, sitting around waiting, and then a bunch of manual labor of moving logs and stones and filling up trenches and all sorts of things like that. And then there was this extremely intense hour or a few hours of actual combat. which would have been psychologically overwhelming. But most of it's boring. Most of it's sitting around.
It was one of the best ways I heard it described was it was days and days of boredom punctuated by a few moments of sheer terror.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So just to kind of go over the second assault one more time here. On July 8th, the clergy actually lead the army in this procession around the city, and that's part of this spiritual preparation for the actual attack.
It's probably imitating the Israelites at Jericho.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, they're spiritually redoing what the Israelites did at Jericho.
Right, and then so we've already talked about how a few days later, July 13th, that night is when Godfrey actually moves his tower clandestinely towards Stephen's Gate. July 14th is actually the day of the big second assault. And again, they're coming at it from both sides. Raymond from his side, close to Mount Zion, and then Godfrey and the two Roberts and Tancred coming at the city from the section of wall near St. Stephen's Gate. And we've already discussed, I guess, what happens with that, the breach in the outer wall, and then eventually Godfrey is able to get his tower up against the wall, and Godfrey's actually commanding from the top of his tower at this point. And
I think it talks about him shooting his crossbow, right?
Yes,
at this point too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good story of like part of the tower got damaged, and he like holds two beams together with one arm while blasting with his crossbow with the other. So I mean, Godfrey was an action hero, and but yeah, I mean, this is kind of his moment where he really shines, I guess you might say, is at the Siege of Jerusalem. Godfrey, kind of sort of the legend of Godfrey of Bouillon begins. But yeah, Godfrey's troops are the ones who are going to actually get into the city first. We have the names of the two guys who first enter Jerusalem. Once the tower is pushed up against the wall, Godfrey's able to throw a drawbridge down, and we've got these guys, Ludolf and Engelbert, who are a pair of knights, and they are brothers, and they are the first guys who get in there. And then at that point, they're able to take control of that part of the wall, and then it's just a matter of time. The sources tell us that Fatimid resistance kind of collapses at this point. And in fact, I believe over on Raymond's side, where he's attacking, Raymond hadn't made much progress in terms of actually being able to get his tower up against the wall, because the Muslims were actually fighting him harder there. They'd been able to prepare better on that side. Raymond's troops actually, all of a sudden, they noticed that suddenly the Muslims are no longer defending the wall that they're attacking, and so they're like, okay, well, let's go, let's get in there, And so at that point, the Crusaders are able to pour through the city. And
one thing to note is that Raymond's tower fails. That is, it's destroyed by fire and stones.
Okay.
But by having a failed tower there, he drew off a lot of the defensive capability of the Muslims,
right?
Making the northern success more probable. Because if they could have moved all their troops that were on the south wall to the north, they may have been able to hold off. So even a failed siege tower can contribute to the success of the attack.
Yeah, that's kind of Raymond's big role. Is he sort of is diversionary? I mean, that's not what he intended, obviously, but yeah, he's able to divert a lot of attention from the other part of the wall that's being attacked. So yeah, Jerusalem is sacked. The Crusaders sack the city. They kill a lot of people. They kill the garrison. A small group of kind of the high-ranking members of the garrison are able to take shelter in the Tower of David, and they agree to surrender only to Raymond of Toulouse. And Raymond's men are able to escort them to safety. Once they're done pillaging the city, the Crusaders very quickly move to worship at the Holy Sepulcher, which, you know, obviously this is the spiritual climax of the crusade. This is what the Crusaders had been wanting to do all this time. And it's kind of, you know, I think the thing that we always hear about in modern discussions of this is how jarring it is from the modern sensibility to read these accounts from like Fulcher of Chartres and the anonymous chronicler who wrote the Gesta Francorum. They talk about, you know, we just slaughtered all the people, you know, who got in our way, and we just took out the Muslims in Jerusalem, and then we're able to go and pray at the Holy Sepulcher, and it's this spiritual high. And for us, you know, it's hard for us to reconcile those two things. But for the Crusaders, you know, this was a sign of God gave us this great victory over the enemy. We were able to vanquish the enemy. We killed them, and then we were able to worship God at the Holy Sepulcher, and, you know, sort of thank Him for this victory He gave us. So I think that's kind of a good way that we can try to conceive of their mindset in the process of capturing Jerusalem. What do you think, guys?
Well, I think there's a couple things to add to that, which I think you're correct. But the first is that we tend to think of the crusade as an army conquering Jerusalem. The Crusaders thought of themselves as pilgrims going to Jerusalem who had to conquer the city to go on pilgrimage. And so, you know, in many of the sources, the Crusaders are called Christians or pilgrims. Mm-hmm. They're not. I don't think they're ever called Crusaders in the first.
No, the actual term crusade didn't come about until almost the 1300s. I think it was sometime around the 1300s, and even then it's an Italian word.
Right, but they saw themselves as pilgrims rather, and that meant going to the Holy Sepulcher was the whole point of everything, because that's what the pilgrims did, and so. We just have to conceptualize to understand what's going on. We have to see it from what they perceived themselves as doing. The second thing to note about the massacre is that they're using the writers. Most of the writers of the Crusades had clerical education or were clerics. The exception being the author of the Gesta Francorum. Most of the other ones were clerics. And so they have all sorts of biblical allusions within their writings to kind of point towards these biblical ideas, which the clerics writing and reading this would have understood, and many modern people would not.
Yeah, biblical and classical.
Yes. Some classical.
A lot of them were very heavily influenced by classical literary styles.
Anna is kind of Anna Komnena, the daughter of Alexos, who writes her history, is in many ways shows off her classical learning, and so do some of the Crusader authors. You know, they make these allusions to classical things to show how smart they are, kind of like professors today do the same type of thing sometimes. That was a joke. Anyway, so we need to contextualize the massacre within the context of the Israelites purging the Canaanites from Israel, from the land of Canaan in the biblical stories, but also the book of Revelation, where Jerusalem is liberated by war from the forces of evil, which is how they conceptualize. That's what they conceptualized themselves as doing, is an apocalyptic liberation of Jerusalem, as you know, described in the book of Revelation. So there's all this sub-level of spiritual and biblical things going on that underlay the whole military activities that are going on.
And typically, you know, and I know we covered this a little bit when we discussed the seizure of Antioch, but you know, from the military perspective, this was a very, very intense military event. When forces would break into a city, And when they would begin when the defenses would collapse, or at least would finally collapse, it was urban warfare has always been and is to this day a very, very intense, violent, confusing, sometimes disorienting affair. Where you basically, it turns into a street by street, block by block, house by house affair. It's sometimes very difficult to distinguish combatants from non-combatants. And in a situation like this, where not only have the Crusaders undergone a difficult siege, but this is the objective for all of them. This is the entire reason that they've even come out here to this part of the world, and endured all the hardships and the struggles and the stress and the physical and mental and emotional privations that must have occurred. This is the culmination of it all. And I don't think it'd be very difficult at all to imagine that emotions were probably running extremely high. When you get into a state, when you've got these very hardened fighters in a state like that, it's really not difficult to understand how maybe there could, there's going to be there's not going to be a whole lot of distinguishing of non-combatants going on, in that kind of thing. Also, I believe did the final assault happen during the day, or was it what time of the day? Do we know that?
I don't know. It was
I think it was early, late afternoon, something like that.
The day the city actually fell was July 15th.
Right.
Yeah.
That's when
another thing, and this definitely happened at Antioch when it fell at night. But if it happened late afternoon, as sunset starts to happen, it's going to start getting darker. That just adds to the to the disorientation and the confusion and whatnot. And in fact, it's probably not hard to imagine that there may have even been a few friendly casualties. And urban warfare has always been extremely difficult, and it's sad to see that you have too many modern scholars who take the literary hyperbole of many of the Crusades chroniclers literally, and they kind of vastly misunderstand the context of what was actually involved in the seizure of a city in pre-modern times, and to be fair, even in modern times. I mean, it's you hear a lot of the same stories from Stalingrad and the fight for Hue City in Vietnam, and even Fallujah's 1 and 2 in the Iraq War. It's you don't you have a lot of the same. You have a lot of similar. Still face a lot of the same challenges within urban warfare. So.
Yeah. So some good points from you guys. Yeah, in terms of the sacking of Jerusalem, I mean, I think it's interesting how, the earliest Muslim source we have for it is Ibn al-Qalanisi, and his description of it is very mundane. I mean, he pretty much just describes it in the way that he describes a lot of other sieges in his chronicle. I mean, he says, they overtook the city. He says a great host were killed, but that's pretty much all he says about who died at the taking of Jerusalem. It's like any other city that's taken by force. I mean, a lot of people are going to die, certainly. This idea that, they killed everybody, that, it was just like one of the most unbelievable atrocities in history or something. I mean, that's overblown. I mean, we know that, there were plenty of Muslims left alive after Jerusalem was taken, because the chroniclers tell us that they were pressed into service and basically put into slave labor, by the Crusaders. So it was certainly a very violent and bloody event. I think it gets often overblown in our discourse, maybe pop culture discourse about exactly what happened. But anyway, so yeah, that's what happens. Jerusalem falls. The Crusaders take control of it, and next time we're gonna talk a little bit more about. Well, next time's gonna be our final episode, and we're gonna discuss the establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the very sort of very beginnings of that. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in its infancy, but it's going to change a lot over the next decade or so after the First Crusade. But we are going to talk a little bit about Godfrey's establishment as defender of the Holy Sepulcher next time. But yeah, so that really kind of brings us to the end of the Siege of Jerusalem. Do you guys have any additional comments that you want to bring up about what happens here?
Other than just one really important thing to remember, and it's a useful bit of information to counter the postmodern popular belief about the fall of Jerusalem, the Crusader seizure of Jerusalem, and the supposed massacre that occurred, and how they just massacred everybody regardless of what religion they were. First off, there were probably very, very few Christians still in the city because, as we mentioned before, most of the Christian inhabitants were expelled by the Fatimid governor before the siege even began. And then many of the chronicles, both Christian and Muslim, mention Jewish prisoners, Jewish captives mostly being ransomed. And then even there's the prominent mentions of high-ranking Muslim families being ransomed and escorted out by by Raymond.
Yeah.
So one thing to remember is just a mere couple of months after the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, you see chroniclers, and you even have more official documents that came from the various Crusader lords and the patriarchs, talking about provisions being made for legal provisions and political provisions being made for both Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem. So there was obviously still large amount of the citizenry left, to warrant these sorts of official administrative actions and things like that. So, this idea that the Crusaders came in and slaughtered everybody and everything, it really is just nonsense. The fact that so many contemporary historians, and fortunately their number is beginning to decline, but the fact that you have so many historians from the modern era who don't recognize medieval hyperbole for what it is, and they take all these things literally, it says way more about them than it ever did about the Crusaders themselves. So,
yeah, I think there's two other things to note that that will become significant for next time. And we may repeat them next time. But at any rate, a lot of the Muslims in the city fled to what we call the Temple Mount, which they called the Haram al-Sharif, which means the noble sanctuary. And Haram in Arabic means a sacred or a special or a restricted place. And it in Muslim tradition, harams are sanctuary. That is to say, they are places you're not supposed to bring weapons. You can't fight there. They are, what a Christian church would call a sanctuary. So you have all these Muslims fleeing to the Temple Mount, thinking they will receive sanctuary there. And in fact, they sort of do, because I think it's Tancred comes in and gives them his banner and basically saying, you're under my protection. But another group of Crusaders comes in, and a bunch of them are killed on the Temple Mount. So from the Muslim perspective, this is the desecration of a holy place where weapons and violence should not occur. The people should have been, protected by the holiness of the site. which the Christians didn't understand or recognize. And the second thing to note is the Christians are going to take the Temple Mount and turn it into, first of all, a palace, and then later the site for the Templars. So we have kind of the ultimate foundation for the whole Templar movement is going to be associated with this Temple Mount, the capture of that. The second thing is that as many people as could, some fled to the Temple Mount, thinking they would receive sanctuary there. Others fled to the citadel, which is called the Tower of David now. And those people essentially held out. They were not attacked and killed because the Crusaders couldn't get in. And they agreed to surrender to Raymond of Toulouse. And he grants them his protection and takes them down to Ascalon. This is going to become very important because the people at Ascalon in a few weeks are only willing to surrender to Raymond of Toulouse because he's the one that kept his word and protected the people he said he'd protect and took them to Ascalon. So the refugees from the citadel are going to be in Ascalon after the Battle of Ascalon, and they're going to say, don't surrender to anybody but Raymond because the rest of the Crusaders won't keep their word. Now, probably Tancred was mad when his safe conduct was violated by somebody else, but nonetheless, that's how it's going to be perceived. And then the struggle between Raymond and Godfrey is going to create a real mess over the future of Ascalon. So, but that's for next time, I think.
Yeah, we'll touch on some of that next time. So yeah, I do think we need to clarify though the idea that the Muslims, let's just be clear. I mean, when the Muslims were originally conquering Palestine in the early Middle Ages, they engaged in widespread violence. I mean, it was a violent conquest too. The way they were able to acquire Jerusalem, of course, was Jerusalem simply surrendered to them. But if that had happened for the first Crusaders, I mean, if when they'd gotten to Jerusalem, the city just said, okay, well, we're gonna give you the city and we're gonna leave. I mean, then there would have been no violent takeover of the city either. So I think we want to be careful about sort of maybe giving the impression that somehow there were different standards among like I know sometimes when we get some of these sort of popular culture presentations about the Crusades, where they try to present the Crusaders as somehow unusually violent, the Muslims had exactly the same standard for the capture of a city as well, and on numerous occasions we know that the Muslims brutally sacked cities, just in the same manner. I mean, it was the same concept. If a city resists, it's going to be sacked, and the inhabitants are going to be slaughtered or enslaved. So well, I just want to clarify that.
The fundamental principle here was that when you surrounded a city, it either resisted or it surrendered. If the city surrendered, then you made terms, and the terms could vary, but there were basically protection of life, payment of a tribute, or we get to occupy the citadel. I mean, there were all sorts of things that could be in the terms there.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But basically, the defenders who surrendered ransomed themselves by paying tribute. They became the prisoners and the slaves of the conquerors, but they were given the chance to ransom themselves. If the city was taken by force, the people were enslaved, and then they could either be sold or they could be ransomed by their relatives or co-religionists. Now, generally speaking, when a city was taken by force, it was in the interest of the conqueror to enslave the population and then make them ransom themselves, or if they couldn't get a ransom for themselves, to sell them in slavery. That potentially a much better deal, but it was certainly considered within the norms of warfare for massacres to occur. Right. And it was not considered, I mean, for our perspective, killing the civilians is against the Geneva Convention and so forth. there was no Geneva Convention back then, but the norms of war for both Muslims, Christians, and also Hindus and Chinese and whatnot was that if a city resists, it can be destroyed. It can be leveled. Everyone could be killed. That generally didn't happen because it was financially, strategically not beneficial to the conqueror. But it happened on a number of occasions, and it was often the case that they would do a massacre in order to terrorize the next city so that they would surrender on terms much quicker.
Right. And we know, in the subsequent history of the Crusader states, there's going to be a lot of episodes where, for example, Baldwin I of Jerusalem captures a city from the Muslims, and he lets the inhabitants, have the choice to leave or to stay. I mean, and to stay under his protection,
Right.
So that there's plenty of that. We've got that sort of behavior both from Muslim leaders and Christian leaders.
And neither side at the time, I mean, they viewed it as something horrific,
normal,
not abnormal, not like the Holocaust is viewed by people today, and rightly so. That's not how the people at the time viewed it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I think we've kind of covered this episode pretty well. Do you guys have any final thoughts, or are we good on the Siege of Jerusalem?
I'm good.
Same here.
Excellent. This has been a great podcast. I really enjoyed doing this with you guys. So Rand, thanks for co-hosting with me.
Always. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. And Dr. Hamblin, again, I just want to say thanks so much for being involved in this series of podcasts. It's been great to have you on.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and be sure and check out Dr. Hamblin's excellent website, crusadingwarfare.net. He's also got a YouTube channel of the same name. Really good stuff. He's pretty much creating a repository of information about Crusades military history with some really good videos and some really good layouts of various battles and sieges. So worth checking out. What have you done most recently, Dr. Hamblin?
Well, most recently I've been playing with my grandkids who were visiting, so I haven't worked much for the past couple of weeks. But right now, my next one that's almost ready is going to be on the way the Crusaders assaulted Nicaea, their technique. So it kind of is reflects the same type of techniques they used in Jerusalem, but it's about the assaults on Nicaea, and then after that's going to be the surrender of Nicaea. And there's some controversy about that between Byzantines and Crusaders over how the city was surrendered. So that's where I am right now.
Yeah, interesting stuff. So and this is Real Crusades history. We're doing these live streams every Tuesday right now. Next Tuesday is going to be our final episode in this First Crusade series. We're going to talk about the battle at Ascalon and the founding of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So that's going to kind of put a bookend on our discussion of the First Crusade. So if you want to be with us again next Tuesday, that's 7 p.m. U.S. Central Time. So just wherever that is in your time. It's 6 p.m. Mountain Time. You can join us for the live stream on Real Crusades History on the YouTube channel. At Real Crusades History, we do regular podcasts and videos on the history of the Crusades. You can find our website at realcrusadeshistory.com. Of course, you can find us on the usual social media, Facebook, YouTube. We have the links in the information box below. Also, you can support us on Patreon if you like our content. The link for that will also be in the information box below this podcast. So, all right, guys. Well, thanks very much. We will talk with everyone next Tuesday. Until then.